Hello and welcome to this lecture series on the Clash of Worlds. We're going to start by talking about the first Americans. One of the big issues in dealing with Native American history is the sheer lack of resources in which to build upon, right? Typically when historians are trying to build a history, they are going to use a combination of archaeology or artifacts combined with documentation. And that allows you to build a more complete picture because it allows you to pick up on the little nuances that you might miss. Well, with Native American history, and specifically North American Native American history, there really isn't any documentation of its early history, right? And so you have to rely exclusively on archaeology. Now, even that can be a little bit problematic because in doing so, you're trying to deal with very wide and varying and complex societies that often were built one on top of the other, right? That evolved over time and evolved in different pathways, right? And so for the sake of this survey course, we'll focus on when it comes to North American Native Americans, we're going to focus on the two primary core clusters, ancestral Pueblo and Mississippi culture. But it really kind of does a disservice to this because there's such a wide variety of other cultures that developed it there as well. Now, we have some later accounts which we can help build these histories as well, like oral accounts, right? Now, ironically, the majority of, at least for North America, the majority of the histories that we have on them are oral histories are based on a project that took place during the New Deal, right? A WPA project in 1936, the Works Progress Administration, conducted a series of surveys amongst the reservations trying to capture the Native American origin stories and stuff like that and actually writing them down. So that's a little limited because it's just things have been passed down so long, and they're mostly, also deeply immersed in mythology, right? Then, of course, you also have the European accounts, which are useful, but also, again, they're limited. They are subject to extreme biases that you have that come with the European accounts, right? Europeans aren't going to write about the common everyday things that they see. That's not interesting. But then when they see, like, for example, the Aztecs sacrificing humans because blood causes life, and you have to give blood to the gods in order for to transfer that to the crops so the crops will grow. Oh, okay, that's interesting, and they'll write that down, right? And so, again, it's very difficult to build a complete picture as a result. So since we are going to rely a lot on archaeology, let's discuss some of the dating conventions that we are going to be using. And I'm going to start off by talking about BC AD versus BCE CE, right? Now, BC AD is probably the most commonly known one, right? And BC, most people know exactly what that stands for. It stands for before Christ or before the birth of Jesus. And AD, a lot of times people think that means after death. It actually means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord, right? For the most part, we have shifted over to a different convention with the same numbers ascribed to them, BCE and CE, which mean before the Common Era, and CE meaning the Common Era, or current era sometimes used as well. In this course, we'll use BCE and CE just because it removes the religious connotation from it. And it's not to slight any one group or another, it's just to create a sense of neutrality. But there's another dating convention that we're going to use, at least when we're talking about some of this really, really far dated histories, an archaeological dating convention known as BP, before present, right? Now, when we talk about before present, we're talking about any time before January 1st, 1950, right? This is an archaeological date that was created mostly because of the invention of carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating was invented around that time by William Libby, right? Carbon-14 dating was used to take organic materials, which over the course of its lifespan will absorb carbon, include in a radioactive isotope called carbon-14, and then once it dies, it slowly releases it at a, well, somewhat measurable rate, right? The rate is not as consistent as sometimes we want to believe, okay? And so we use that as the cut point. A lot of times it's really easy just to round it because we're talking about really, really long dates, all right? That's a pretty common dating method for this really ancient stuff. It is also very fallible. It's very easy to contaminate the samples, and it's not very accurate. Carbon-14 dating is at best plus or minus 50 years. but typically it's more like plus or minus 200. And there are other systems out there, other methods that are also slowly growing in popularity. One of them is a pretty well-known one, and it's called dendrochronology. This is tree rings, right? Counting of tree rings. This one allows you to establish very precise timelines if you can set up the chronology in the first place. Another one that's growing in popularity, though, is one that's called optically stimulated luminescence. This is similar to carbon-14 dating in that it measures isotopes. However, it can do this in non-organic materials, right? It basically can determine how long has this typically silicon-based item been out of contact with the sun. How long has it been buried? So with our dating convention established, now let's see how we can get humans onto the American continents. About 2.6 million years ago, the Earth entered what was called the Pleistocene epoch, right? This is also more commonly referred to as the last ice age, okay? Glaciers will extend in the northern hemisphere as far south as the Ohio River Valley. And it also means that the sea level is going to be significantly lower, about 400 feet lower than it is today, okay? This in turn created a land bridge between Asia and North America that we refer to as Beringia, right? And this land bridge created a pathway for animals and humans to get into the American continents. Now, there's a whole lot of competing theories on how and where they came from, and including one theory that said that first humans in the Americas actually came from Europe by boat, but we won't entertain that one, at least not in this class. But the most accepted archaeological theories out there say that humans crossed over into the American continent in 3 waves. The first one happening around 30,000 BP, and then a second one happening around 16,500 BP, and then a possible third one around 15,000 BP. Okay. Now, around 11,700 BP, this ice age ends, sea levels start to rise, and Beringia goes away, right? Now, to support these theories, there's a lot of new science being applied to this, trying to establish what they're calling a genographic footprint of the first Americans. And it relies very heavily on DNA research, DNA studying the different haplogroups of the remains and of the artifacts being found here in these archaeological sites, right? Now, a haplogroup is a category of a genetic population. And what we're finding through tests of Y chromosome DNA and mitochondrial DNA, the difference being is one traces the male line, Y chromosome, and the other the female line, is that you can trace where these populations have moved. And what they've found is that on the Y chromosome side of things, that the predominant Native American DNA haplogroup is haplogroup Q. Haplogroup Q exists largely in the Americas and only to a small degree in Eastern Asia. It is not found in Africa or in Europe or even in Australia. On the mitochondrial side of things, there are 5 predominant haplogroups, A, B, C, D, and X, that are all found exclusively in America, with haplogroup D being the most important because that appears to be the first group of Americans. That's these first Americans. Now, that being said, the one thing that we can say with certainty is that all of these humans moving into the Americas are just that. They're Homo sapiens sapiens, right? There are no subgroups. There's no Homo erectus. We've never found any evidence of that. Neanderthal, there's never been any evidence found of that. These are all fully developed Homo sapiens sapiens. Now, by the time Beringia went away and the humans got isolated on the American continents, there was no farming happening yet anywhere, and there was no domesticated animals really yet anywhere, right? And so as the populations developed, they began to do things like domesticate animals, dogs, of course, being one of the earliest ones, and other animals as well. Now, for the Americans, this causes a problem because there's very few large animals. In Asia, Europe, and Africa, you're going to have some large animals that will be domesticatable, right? Not all animals are domesticatable, right? And so they're going to domesticate cow, horse, oxen, and these things don't exist in the Americas. And these things can do large amounts of labor, right? That's the key thing. If they can do the labor, that frees your people up to do other things. So as farming develops, it is easier in Asia and Europe comparatively to the Americas. Now, that being said, they did domesticate some animals, right? Like, for example, the llama, dogs, of course, turkeys, guinea pigs. But again, none of these are really capable of doing things like ripping stumps out of fields and stuff like that. And think about this for a second. How many guinea pigs do you think you would have to hook up to a plow in order to plow a field? How many hundreds of guinea pigs harnessed to this plow? And now, how many of you really want to see that now that I put that idea in your head? Now, despite the lack of large animals to do work, you still are going to see some Native American groups come out of the Archaic period. Archaic just meaning the hunter-gathering phase. But it's going to vary by region, and some don't do it at all. Like, for example, the Pacific Coast nations are actually going to just adapt the archaic hunter-gathering things to sedentary ways of life and make it work, right up to European contact, right? You're going to have the development of corn farming initially in Guerrero, Mexico, sometime around 4300 BCE, and that'll find its way to the American Southwest around 2100 BCE. Okay, it was developed from a wild grain called teosinte, right? Corn is not going to make it to the East Coast until around 400 to 500 CE. However, the East Coast is actually going to develop farming pathways of their own, right? The Adena people, for example, will develop what we refer to now as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, in which they domesticated plants like sunflowers and pumpkins and squash, and then come 400, 500, you add corn to the mix too. In these cases, though, where you have agriculture become predominant, you start to see a sedentary way of life develop. Villages, right? You got to stay with the crops. You can't go off hunting and gathering anymore. With that would come specialization, right? Social stratification, governments, right? You start to have people that you don't need everybody collecting food anymore, so they develop into specializations. You start to see things like artists and builders and priests and kings, right? You see art develop, right? Art and complex religion. People have time to ponder where they came from, why they're here. And then, of course, advances in technology. Not just technologies to make life better in the general sense, but technologies in way to view the world in general. The Native Americans, in fact, were avid astronomers in many of the places that you take a look at, and we'll talk about some of them later on.